Greetings, persons of quality. As a friend of mine used to say. Welcome back to more exciting cyber security, info security excitement. Today, working on the fifth module in our journey through Mark Champia's excellent CompTIA Security Plus guide, introducing you to all the cybers. We today are going to talk about different types of mobile and how those things get deployed, how to secure those things, the types of vulnerabilities that you're suspect to, and then the issues around securing those things in corporate land. All of the different types of devices, and we'll break down the list here in a second, do indeed have their own kind of lists. And we've got tricks and techniques to secure those. These are the devices that I think most of us at this point are very familiar with. You know, you've got the little tablets that generally use some sort of touch interface. You have smartphones, which are like small tablets from a certain point of view, that usually the worst thing smartphones do is phone, has been my recent experience. So they're usually pretty good at all the other stuff, but not so great at being phones. Wearables, such as smart watches and things to, you know, keep track of your heart rate and how well you're sleeping and how well your run is going if you have like one of these GPS guys. The smartwatch, in my estimation, is no longer the king of that particular hill, as I think most folks are moving away from having wires dangling from their ears and headed towards having like little devices that they stuff into their heads to create what is kind of like the first augmented reality technology that's very popular. So smartwatches plus maybe earbuds interface with our computers all the time. Portable computers, you know, where you want to draw the line between a laptop and portable computer is questionable. Sometimes manufacturers intentionally blur those lines, like Microsoft and their Microsoft Surface, which is a detachable computer, like the one we'll look at on this next screen here, or their Surface Book, which is a laptop that just happens to blow apart like that. That is a very nice looking two-in-one device. For my work, I need a laptop that I can do this on, right? So that it has to have some sort of touch interface that I can use, some kind of writing instrument to draw students' attention to particular things on these PowerPoint slides I do so love. And then they break out the difference between a web-based computer, and I think what we're talking to there is like a Chromebook, a device where the operating system is really, in the case of a Chromebook, it's a browser, right? The little bitty guys don't have much processing power and usually not a lot of storage power for themselves to go through that. All of these things may be featured on your mobile device, and like the dividing line between these gets blurry. My laptop has a slot for a SIM card that will make it into a cell phone, right? So it too can be crappy at calls. Mostly that SIM card is there for making data connections to, you know, whichever network mobile provider you're working with. So these small form factor mobile OS, iOS, Apple's iOS, Wi-Fi or cellular access, a bunch of apps, usually available through an app store, local non-removable storage. It used to be popular in Android phones to have additional removable storage. I think my current phone does that, but like with half a freaking terabyte of storage, who needs more? On top of that, that's going to be slow and mess up your apps. Usually syncs to something. So your iOS device syncs to your iCloud account, your Google device syncs to your Google Drive or your Google Photos at the very least. Has some GPS in there, has some GPS in there, has a microphone and digital camera, maybe. Has Wi-Fi or wireless cellular, maybe. Then has all kinds of personal area network, near field communication, I was a big fan of the Ant Plus protocol that Garmin went all in on. Like I have an Ant Plus scale that no longer can I use because no longer are they shipping Ant Plus chips in the latest set of Samsung phones. Maybe removable storage. Like I said, do you know if your phone would accept an additional memory chip? Mine think will. That might be a slot for a second cellular card in there. I'm not 100% sure. And then using itself as removable storage in another device. Some of us discover this accidentally when we plug our phones into computers to charge, and it asks, do you want to allow connection to that? We should be familiar with the different types of networks that you can connect to. So usually a mobile device, even an iPad or a tablet will have the option for this, or laptops. For some sort of cellular coverage, cellular coverage is coverage that's broken into cells, hence cellular. Those usually have some MTSO or mobile telecommunications switching office that that handles calls essentially. They probably also have a Wi-Fi connection, so you can connect to a wireless local area network. Laptops, if we're talking about those as mobile devices, frequently, although not all the time, have a RJ45 connector, which lets you plug an actual LAN cable in there, or we'll accept a USB connector. Once upon a time, there was a lot of excitement about infrared. Particularly, my favorite application of infrared communications technology was that I could usually find an app that would make my device into a universal remote, and at the bar, I could change the game to the game I wanted to watch, but not everybody thinks that's fun. And then almost all of these devices will have either some letter of USB, so probably USB-A, or maybe USB-C these days, the little tiny connectors that allow you to connect. When we mentioned that cellular data on a cellular network is broken into cells, usually what that means is you will see connections from multiple towers available to your device at a given time, which is swell for you, but doesn't always work out great in terms of communication. In terms of privacy, it's sort of a disaster since it lets your cellular provider know your location all the time, which some people are surprised when they learn that. Usually you can probably find an application that will work with your device, and I'm pulling one up on mine right now, that will let you access the signal strength on your network based on who is connected. So right now it's showing me network availability and the different cellular towers that I can connect to. So usually they will tell you not only which networks are available, but like how much connection you've got. Some of it's green, so it's going through the phone or through the green screen. It'll tell you that, and like network status for popular users in your area. This one's listing Verizon as the fastest upload and T-Mobile as the fastest down on average for their customers here, and the latency based on like the ping timeout. So you can usually dig up information about where you are in relation to these towers, and then similarly through the MTSO, your cellular provider can dig up information about where you are. This is the list of the various models of how an organization is going to handle the process of you've got one of these crazy devices and your organization wants to give you access to organizational resources on it, but we don't really want the organization to be able to nuke my phone. And maybe if I work for a very secure organization, they want to have a corporately owned device where the enterprise manages the whole thing and you're allowed to only use that for corporate business and the enterprise runs that. But usually organizations wind up someplace in the middle. BYOD these days is very popular, where employees bring their own device, BYOD. and the employer has access to parts of the device. At the college, for example, our Google Workplace, I guess is what they're calling the Google services, including Gmail, has access to that stuff. And if the company has an employee go rogue, like if Rosema goes rogue, they can pull all the stuff that is related to the company off the phone, but not my own data. So it's like sandboxed off into its own little place. So popular with smaller companies and bigger companies as well. Corporate owned, personally enabled is kind of the worst of all worlds. So the company's buying a phone and then handing it to the employees. The company's paid for, but they also let you do personal activities on it. It's a weird place to be with your employer, especially like your friends learn that phone number, you leave the company at some point. It's an ugly place. That's a place where I'm like, okay, I'm buying another phone. Because you guys, I don't really want you that deep into my business. Choose your own device is often nice, but again, it's usually like the corporation owns the device and you just happen to get to pick out which one you want. And then VDI, I think, is an interesting and like place where there's been a lot of advancement, particularly with people going home for COVID, where the organization builds a virtual infrastructure and then you use any old device to connect to what appears to be a running computer, usually running Windows something, 10, soon 11, on a server virtually, and then you connect to that device for all enterprise related activities. Can get like licensing can get expensive doing that, but kind of my favorite option. You get to keep like tight eye on what's going on the infrastructure there. So there are pros and cons to all of these. All of the like BYOD models let, management have enough control to do what they need to do, keep the costs down. The employees, if they have bad choices in their work-life balance, can increase their productivity. Although I think there's a lot of research that says you should have some work and then you should have some life. And you probably shouldn't let those bleed over and be checking your email at the dinner table while you're neglecting your children. But don't let me preach that to you. You might want to check out Digital Minimalism. A guy named Cal Newport wrote a bunch of good books on similar subjects. It is nice to reduce IT infrastructure. It is nice to have less internal hardwares going on. And then if you're a user, you get to pick the device or the carrier, possibly, especially if it's BYOD, that's your phone. You're choosing to do their business on it for free. Sucker. No. Just playing. Sometimes people really fired up about their careers. So this does impose a bunch of security risks on the organization. So those devices will potentially have vulnerabilities between upgrade cycles. Android and iOS are guilty of this all the time. Usually a modern Android device, if you believe Zerodium, is more secure, but the problem with Android devices is that most of them aren't modern and kept up to the latest dates, and they're something like 80% of the devices on the planet. iOS, as long as you're within, the last 5 years or so, will keep giving you new updates and fixing those vulnerabilities as they crop up. In terms of like connection vulnerabilities, it's possible that your very connection to different things will disclose the least location information, if not more. And then letting folks use corporate connected devices to access whatever content it is that they want, again, is potentially bad news bears. So these will walk off on you if you're not careful. I always think it is a foolish thief who steals a device with a camera, a GPS chip, and a internet connection. But I mean, don't hate the player, hate the game, I suppose. But they are frequently lost, like leaving one in the back of a cab or whatever. If you've ever had that moment of terror where you walk away from like a cab and go, oh. But it's a solvable problem if you can do a over-the-air wipe of a device, or at least an over-the-air lock of a device. You can use Find My Phone type applications to get them back. Not the biggest deal. The OSs usually these days can have both OS updates through the manufacturer slash software provider. So Android rolls out updates for the operating system on a monthly schedule, and then the vendor of the phone is required to apply whatever testing and magic is necessary to go onto that, and then that gets rolled out usually with 2 week lag is where Samsung's been at behind the Android updates as of late on my Samsung Galaxy 21S XYZ or whatever. If your operating system vendor, aka Apple, makes both the operating system and the hardware, they tend to roll them out at all at once. You don't have that little lag going on, which is a huge benefit. You'll get that if you use a Google Pixel device. That since Google makes the phone, they also make the operating system. It rolls out in real time. Depending on the tools you're using as an organization to push updates and software to your phones, you may be able to do updates over the wire specific to the organization. I've spoken a little bit about location tracking and that mobile devices are usually reporting your location back to at least the cellular company you are getting service from, potentially putting that information into media you are creating. I hope most of you should be aware that there are usually little checkboxes on your phones to turn on and off the GPS tags in your videos. If not, you might want to go check that out. Usually it gets pulled down from most social media applications, but when you are just taking videos or photos, the information is tagged in there, and actually super useful if you ask me. I love being able to search my photos by location, but you do you. Potentially, if malware is installed on a device, your bad guys can go through and, if there's malware installed on a device that gives root access, that person can do all the things the phone can do. So including unauthorized recording. We talk a lot about how people are terrified to use like an Alexa or a Google Home type device in their bedrooms. I'm like, my guess would be you sleep next to 17 cameras and 15 microphones on your phones. Untrusted content, obviously a problem. If folks are jailbreaking or rooting devices, that could be a problem for an organization, particularly if they're putting in either unofficial software or a third-party app store that's not authorized. If you paid any attention to the hubbub between Apple and the nice folks who make Fortnite. Fortnite at one point asked you to just sideload the app onto, I think that was specifically Android devices. But they would love it if they could just get out of Apple's business with the sideloading thing. You can receive all kinds of media through various messaging apps. One of the things I love is every now and then Apple iMessage vulnerability will show up where if I send a particular character inside of a message, it does something bad to the phone, and my oldest son always has a bad day that day. My daughter's about to get on that bus too. QR codes have been an interesting problem with the coronavirus making people afraid of touching menus. So it seems like every restaurant I have been to since we kind of came out of lockdown has a QR code menu that you can go to, and I'm, as a security kind of guy, I am just loving the fact that people are walking around going to random websites at restaurants. It's totally tempting to just print up a bunch of stickers that go to at least warning sites, right? Not malicious websites, but websites that say, you realize you're loading a website based entirely on the fact that you saw a sticker, right? So that's not great. So you can do that as an attacker that can contain a malicious URL. You can also use the practice of malvertising. Bad guys can purchase ads from Google or any of the other automated ad fulfillment services and send those links to potentially bad places. Also a useful use for, there have been, malvertising is the term for that, campaigns where folks are using bad images with steganographically encoded code, JavaScript or what have you, into the image, and then uploading that image as one part of it, and then having JavaScript somewhere else on the site that pulls the steganographic attack out to bypass image and security precautions from those providers. Tethering, potentially a vulnerability for your organization. USB OTG, where you can use either a malicious connection or a malicious, so a computer that's got bad intent or a flash drive that's got bad intent could potentially harm your computer. That's not great. You don't want that. Any kind of, or if your system is being used as the external media, that could similarly be bad for you. Our friends at Hack5 would be more than happy to sell you a wonderful, what are they calling these days? I don't even know if they have them in stock. They tend to take off pretty quickly. Yeah, that would be it. The malicious cable. Ooh, they have a malicious cable detector to go along with the OMG Lightning to USB or USB-C malicious cables that let you get all sorts of hooked up. Hello. Oh man, got to get me one of those. But those are all kinds of super fun. So they can oftentimes do enough to get the operating system into some big trouble. Setting up a hotspot, potentially you're sharing wireless access, which is at least resources in the organization. If they tend to happen to set that up with like a poorly secured VPN, they could be providing Wi-Fi access to your virtual private networking. So how do we defend these devices? You probably should be thinking seriously about using strong authentication for them and setting them up properly. You are usually going to need a strong passcode and then ideally a strong screen lock. And like depending on what's going on with the operating systems right this minute, those may include passcodes or pins of a particular length in order to do the kind of securing you want to do. Also might include biometrics like a fingerprint and this screenshot, man, this has got to be from like Android 1. But this is the pattern you would swipe and, relatively secure, not super secure. Fingerprint, there's also Face ID that would go into there. But ideally, you want somebody to not be able to get into a device easily, right? You want them to have to work for it at the very least. So we love screen locks. Probably not strong enough for most things, although if it's encryption, that's great. Speaking of encryption, so now most devices have full disk encryption of some sort at least. Although you might be able to get into remote data at rest. So what does that mean for the average iPhone user? They have remote data at rest in terms of an iCloud backup. Apple's got the keys to those as of this writing, so they could get into it. There was a big dust up where the FBI wanted access to essentially everybody's iPhone by pushing a vulnerable update to iOS. Apple pushed back on that. Had they just walked the iPhone back over to the user's apartment and let it connect to his Wi-Fi and upload the iCloud backup, they would have had access to that like they do everybody else's iCloud backup. Storage segmentation is what we were talking about when we were talking about there's the corporate sandbox that's got stuff in there, sometimes pushed into a container that keeps business stuff on the business side of things and personal stuff on the personal side of things. So your company does not get involved with privacy and legal issues. Like you probably have sensitive health data on your phone if you are a person who actually has sensitive health data. I know the youngs don't probably even know their doctor's telephone number, but when you get older, you got them test results on your cell phone, and my company doesn't want to see those, right? They don't want to have to worry about protecting my HIPAA compliant data. So containerizing that stuff off is a good move. And then those Find My iPhone threat services, usually have fun things like the ability to do a remote wipe, to erase at least the sensitive data. The nastier ones take pictures of the thief. So every time somebody tries to unlock the phone, it takes a picture and uploads it somewhere. This is sort of Mark's good how to not get your phone stolen device. So, don't run around in high risk areas with like, I've got the latest iPhone. It cost me thousands of dollars. That's not a good move. This is like good life advice. Avoid becoming distracted by what is on your phone in general. In general, holding your phone with both hands. Okay. While you are on an escalator or in near train doors, I think his theory there is like somebody's gonna snatch that as you go past on an escalator or as the doors to the subway shut. Somebody ganks your phone right out from your hand. He's long been worried about the fact that for a long time, white earbuds, the definitely from Apple earbuds, were a very conspicuous, almost status symbol. So get a pair of cheap black earbuds, I guess is his advice there. Nowadays with in ears, that's not a thing. And while I might hang onto my phone extra hard if a young tough attempted to take my phone away from me, I don't know if I would. I don't know. I'm not getting into a foot chase over my phone. I'm just gonna go onto my laptop, lock it, start taking pictures of it, not fight. Maybe. We'll see. Hopefully that never happens. Usually, these are things like your Find My iPhone, Find My Mobile. Things will do. That thief picture I was taking about that'll snap a picture every time somebody tries to log in or fails X number of times, locking people out remotely, finding the GPS coordinates. I've heard that called a distress beacon, where it takes, as the battery charge gets down, it will blast out its GPS location to the internet, to servers that it's connected to make sure that we at least know where it was when it died. And then an alarm that they can't shut up is always fun until they have to power off the phone. Those are pretty common to both what you can do for yourself just by setting up your iCloud or your Samsung Find My Mobile or your Google Find My Device account, as well as what the more expensive corporate stuff will do as well. You will hear those tools, the more expensive corporate stuff, described as MDN or mobile device management, whatever tool your organization chooses, and there's a bunch of them to handle doing all of this onboarding, offboarding stuff. Microsoft and the folks at Google both have some level of this type of functionality built into their Office client applications. So the Gmail of the world and Google Calendars as in Microsoft Office 365. I never know if it's a circle or a year. And then they also let you do things like manage applications. We had a discussion earlier where we were talking about using the mobile device management software as a way to push test applications to mobile devices and then use the VPN that's on the mobile device management tool to VPN back into on-premises corporate resources. That's all kinds of fun. They can also help you do mobile content management. So if you have an organization that runs a blog, that you could have people working on that. And then if you could use unified endpoint management software that will not only do the computers in an organization, but also do the other endpoints like laptops, laptops are computers, but like tablets, like phones, that kind of thing. So you get all of that in what the marketing people love to call all of that in a single pane of glass, all of that under one application. Some of the more like industry specific stuff are these embedded devices or specialized devices, which have their own whole level of headache to be dealt with. So you've got, what we think of when we think of, regular computer systems are one headache, but embedded devices, so computers that are built into specialized things like any high-tech piece of medical equipment or any high-tech vehicle, for example, has basically a computer inside of it. Sometimes those control industrial systems. Sometimes they are built into Internet of Things devices where they're responsible for thermostats and power switches and things like that that can become troublesome from a security perspective. You may have had an opportunity to play around with a Raspberry Pi that is basically just a very little computer that usually runs Linux. Although a field programmable gate array that does some kind of specialized functions could potentially be a security concern. There's a whole fleet of Raspberry Pi like system on chip devices that work with different operating systems, different manufacturers. Sometimes they run an RTOS, a real time operating system, so they'll be involved in some kind of time sensitive type of application. In terms of specialized systems, you might see a digital smart meter or other digital tracking device. I run into this guy at GurCon every year who's a big part of installing, maintaining, and securing smart meters for gas servicing. There's all kinds of other stuff. I'd mentioned medical, but aircraft, vehicles, sometimes you have sonar and radar and LiDAR or laser emitted to do all the things now. As of this recording, Tesla just released its beta of fully autonomous driving. Let's see how well that works out. And there's huge concern about the potential hacking of things in our ICS or industrial control or SCADA, supervisory control and data acquisition systems that are things that potentially control physical processes. So our friends at Saudi Aramco had some issues with these. There have been a bunch of hacks that nobody's really gone like Pearl Harbor with any of this stuff. But the big concern about this is where the cyber infrastructure interacts with the physical infrastructure. And at some point, you could have a problem where somebody turns a dial up on a water treatment plant and dumps a bunch of chemicals into the water, which actually just happened about a year ago. Somebody caught it before it got to be a problem, but it's a thing that happens. So these are the advantages of the smart meter over the old analog dialy meter from the perspective of the organization. So like it's nice to have easy meter readings that can be done remotely, a battery that's maintained, and doesn't need to be changed out every 20 years, that if it's being tampered with, it can let you know, and that it can say to the utility company, hey, we're in the middle of an emergency. In cars, potentially, and there's always a car hacking village at our local hacker convention, which is lots of fun to go play around with if you have the opportunity. Has all kinds of stuff from night vision to exhaust noise suppression. If you don't have an OBDII interface to your car, it can save you hundreds of dollars in service calls when you forget to close the gas cap and it trips a engine light. You can just go hit the button on your phone and look up the code and see it's not a problem and clear it. Although, don't take safety advice from a cybersecurity instructor. Just don't. You've also got things like HVAC or heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems. These are specifically picked out because these have been starting points for attacks on pretty major organizations. They get into the controls for the HVAC system, and the next thing you know, they're on the network. MFPs are multifunction printing devices, things that have that big thing in the middle of the office that used to be just a copier, but now it's a copier, a printer, a scanner, a faxer, all in one device. Again, it's got an operating system on it. It needs to be kept up to date. Oftentimes that falls behind. And the next thing you know, people are logging into your MFP to get onto your network. There were a bunch of them that were exposed. If you look up the exciting PewDiePie versus I believe it was Indian music company race to have the most followers on YouTube. Some Yahoo just used vulnerability for printers on the internet to spray out a bunch of vote for PewDiePie kind of like and subscribe things. No better way to get YouTube subs than to break into somebody's printer and print off an advertisement. That always makes me rush right out and smash that like and subscribe, hit the bell, ding. UAVs, potentially scary things to have hacked into. Drones are now fully autonomously killing people in a number of war zones. So, like, surveillance and deliveries and aerial photography is one thing. Inspecting infrastructure, that's great too. Racing is fun, but people are strapping missiles to these things now, and if those get hacked, that's no good. You'll notice in terms of the IoT, the S in IoT is for security. That's a cyber joke about how there is no security in IoT. Folks are working on it though. There are a number of projects underway. Microsoft has a pretty good one where they're trying to make sure that your IoT gizmos, I mean, if you want them to be secure, buy them from a reputable vendor who is going to provide software updates when vulnerabilities are found, and inevitably they will be found, and be prepared to replace them if they do find a vulnerability that's not fixable, which is a thing that happens. There are folks using bad software in their software that's never going to get updated, and they're not going to update it themselves. There you go. So throw those things out. There's lots of stuff out there. IoT toothbrush, IoT washing machine. I have an IoT meat thermometer that I absolutely love. Like, it is nice to be able to like put the brisket in the grill, put the IoT meat thermometer into it, and wherever I am on the planet, I can get an update that that brisket's done or burned, depending on how well I'm doing that thing. This concept of body area network is where you've got a bunch of sensors on a body that collaborate. Like, I have a heart rate monitor and a sometimes a Bluetooth device connected to me, uploading that along with GPS information all the time, which is super nice. But in medical practice, like, they're doing great things for folks who have like type 1 diabetes and need to regulate their insulin in their blood based on their blood sugar. So you can have a sensor attached, reading your blood sugar, feeding back to the device, talking to the pump, pumping in appropriate insulin, yada, 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 which can like keep the insulin resistant process for a long time, which is super nice. So that would be the autonomous body sensor network, which would be super cool. All of those things are going to have the security issues that exist for computers and the other like complications that go along with being IoT. Like, IoT doesn't really want to consume a lot of power, doesn't have a lot of compute, may not have a lot of network. So those are tricky. Cryptography wants to use electricity and compute in order to make the crypto happen. If they're not being maintained by a reputable vendor who's taking care of them, you may not be able to patch that. They may not do any authentication. They may not have access to things at a long range. We're trying to keep costs down, which might mean that security goes by the wayside. Frequently you will find things with weak defaults, so an admin password, or root and support, or something simple and well known. And by well known, we mean you probably can do a Google search for your IoT device, and if you can Google search my IoT device default password and that works, you might want to work on changing that. There are, like I had mentioned earlier, there's a bunch of industry initiatives underway to try and get these things going. I mean, the trick is you have to find somebody who becomes a monopoly, essentially, before it really gets working. There's a bunch of legislation that's been fired up. The IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act is out there. California, as often is the case, is leading the way in terms of regulation, and hoping that their IoT regulations, if you want to sell stuff to I think California is like the 5th or 6th biggest economy in the world. If it was a country unto its own, if you want to sell stuff to that country, you got to follow their regulations. They want reasonable security features that help figure out what the device is capable of. So seems like a legitimate place to start. Here's hoping that catches on. So there you go. That's the mobile stuff and the IoT stuff and the other stuff that we really couldn't shoehorn into any other chapter stuff. Basically, tablets, computers, smartphones, tablets, smartphones, and wearables. Oftentimes very similar functionality to your desktop computer. They have fun connectivity methods, including cell connectivity and other types of wireless access, Wi-Fi. Pick your Wi-Fi number. Wi-Fi 6 is the new hotness these days. There's a lot of different ways that employees will access corporate data depending on who owns what device. That will fall into many different categories. There are definitely security risks associated with using those mobile devices, including the content they access, the users on the other end of the devices are a big deal, but you should think about how those get set up. Organizations will handle that using mobile device management, mobile device application management, and mobile device content management systems to help users make the best choices, ? We hope. And then there's all of the new embedded and specialized devices that are there. And unfortunately, it is frequently the case that security in those things is not particularly well thought out, but is what it is. And that's all the stuff we want you to know about mobile devices and such.